So if everyone can make their way back to their seats, we're going to get started with our next speaker, who needs no introduction because he was already introduced this morning by Kevin Walker. Hey folks, I know we're excited. 250. If you haven't already, our shop outside, we've got books from the authors. Some 250th merch that's left, so purchase that while it's here. And without further ado, let's get started. We got Dr. John Maass again, guiding us into another fascinating topic. So John?
Okay, let me start out by paraphrasing Shakespeare. I come not to bury Gates, but to appraise him. So this will be the first time I'm actually giving this talk. Just started working on it, perfecting it. I let my 25-year-old daughter review it, and I said, "Well, what do you think?" And she said, "Well, Gates is really old." So not a lot of help there. Is that okay? Can you hear me? Okay, good. So she actually was a lot more interested in history when she was younger. And in the 4th grade, just like Rob said, his kids are in Virginia schools. 4th grade is Virginia history and U.S. history and a lot of that stuff. And the first day they started in the Revolution, in her class, she told the teacher, "My daddy is a professional military historian." And the teacher said, "Well, I bet he's been to a lot of battlefields, and I bet you've been to a lot of battlefields." And she said, "I've been to more battlefields than Robert E. Lee." So there was a time when she was interested. All right, so we're going to talk about Major General Horatio Gates, and I find Gates one of the most interesting figures of the Revolution, and he really was. The more you look into him and read about him, the more you realize that he was involved in a lot of the major episodes, not just Saratoga, which was his finest campaign, or the Battle of Camden, which was not his finest campaign. But also, he was very much a part of what Washington and his officers that were in his camp called Conway Cabal. He was involved somehow in what's called the Newburgh Conspiracy, many things along those lines, which we're going to talk about today, but we're going to have to hit them very, very quickly in order to have time here. So wanted to mention one thing that we have coming up, and we have a symposium at the National Army Museum, and that is going to be on May 7th and 8th this year, and it's going to be on the middle years of the Revolutionary War. So we'll hope you, if you are interested in that, come see me either at the break or at lunch, and I'll give you my card, and I'll tell you exactly how to register. And at lunch, right after lunch, we're also going to hear from Bruce Venter about a conference in Richmond at the end of March that he will be running as well. So we got a lot of good stuff in Virginia on the Revolutionary War. So we'll hear from Bruce soon. Okay, why don't we just start on this slide here, or on this slide here. So Horatio Gates he was in his late 40s when the Revolutionary War began, and he was often called Granny Gates because he wore spectacles, and he tended to perch them at the end of his nose. And having just turned 60, to be called Granny at age 48, I'm a little sensitive about it. He was born July 26, 1727 in England. His mother, Dorothea, was the housekeeper first for the Duke of Leeds and then for the Duke of Bolton. And so even though she has, housekeeper doesn't mean the maid. It means the person who ran the household of these large estates. And so she had a lot of connections through the families that she worked for. And so Gates made a lot of connections. For example, his godfather was Horace Walpole, the famous politician and historian of the 18th century. He entered military service in 1745 with the 20th Foot. He served in Germany during the War of the Austrian Succession, which ended in 1748. He was on Governor Edward Cornwallis's staff when Cornwallis became the governor of Nova Scotia from 1749 to 1750. This Cornwallis, the Governor Cornwallis, was the uncle of Charles Lord Cornwallis that we know from the Revolutionary War. In 1754, he was a captain, had a captain's commission in the 45th Regiment. And sometime between the end of 1754 and the beginning of 1755, he had a commission in the 4th New York Independent Company. And the British stationed several independent companies in America in the mid-1750s as the relationship and the politics with France started to become strained. And these were independent companies, so they were not associated with any particular regiment. There were 4 in New York, and there were 3 in South Carolina. He, as a captain, he commanded one of the New York companies. Now, he also served in Braddock's campaign in 1755 and got to know a lot of Americans, including George Washington, and fellow officers, including Charles Lee. He was wounded at Braddock's defeat, and he served as the brigade major to General Robert Monckton in 1760. And served with Monckton on the victorious expedition to take the island of Martinique in 1762. In fact, he was chosen, one of the traditions in 18th century warfare is that with the news of a victory, the commander would assign a junior officer to bring that news back to London and Westminster to tell Parliament and the King, and that was considered to be a great honor. And so he was chosen to bring the news of the victory of Martinique back to London, and he was given a commission as a major in 1764. Now that speaks very well of him because he was not of the financial means to purchase a commission as a major. This was given to him as a reward for his service in Martinique and elsewhere. And so that's where he wound up. His highest rank in the British Army was as a major. Soon after the 7 Years' War / French and Indian War, he retired on half pay. Some personal information about him: in 1755, he married Elizabeth Phillips and had a son whose name was Robert. He was born in 1758. Interestingly, Robert died during the American Revolution in America of an illness, and very little is known about where that happened, where he was serving, when he died of an illness, and even where he's buried. It's almost impossible to get information about that. On the web, I've seen 3 different dates for his birth. I've even seen that he was in the British Army. He was not. He was on the American side. So by 1770 in England, Gates became known as a Republican, meaning someone who favored more rights for individuals, not in a radical sense, but he was very much in favor of American liberties. And at an early date of 1770, he did not favor the Stamp Act and the Sugar Act and other acts, some of which Rob told us about a few minutes ago. So in 1772, he moved to America, and he wrote to his old colleague from Braddock's campaign, George Washington, and asked for some advice about where to set up in America. And Washington and Gates were not friends at the time, but they had campaigned for that entire Braddock's expedition and knew each other pretty well, at least militarily. And he bought a plantation called Traveler's Rest. And this is in West Virginia. It's about 40 minutes from here. And it's, roughly speaking, just roughly, it's basically between Martinsburg and Charlestown, West Virginia. The image on the right is a 1930s image of the house. The image on the left is much more modern, about 10 years ago. You can see it from the public road. There's actually a pretty long driveway down to the house that didn't. I went there yesterday. It did not say "Welcome, John" on it. I did not go down the driveway, but you can see it from the house, at least in the winter time. And it's basically in this condition here, called Traveler's Rest. Now, he supported the American cause enthusiastically in 1775. He received a Brigadier General's commission in June of 1775, and his skills really were administrative. He was known as a very good organizer, and when you think of how Boston was with militia companies and regiments from the New England states, everything was new, supply, organizing companies into regiments into brigades. That was really his strong suit. And so he was made the first adjutant general of the Army, and the Army Adjutant General's Court today regards him as the first U.S. Army Adjutant General. Began service in Boston, which you see the map here. This is actually an engraved porcelain image of Gates in about 1776, and it's only about 2 inches high and a little less than an inch wide. Now, in May of 1776, he was promoted to Major General and took charge of the Northern Army, which was the area in New York and Canada at this time. This was a thrust into. There was a lot of military activity in New York and Canada, focused around capturing Quebec. I won't go into the details right now because we're going to focus on really biography here. He ran into a lot of trouble with Major General Philip Schuyler, and Gates's commission and his orders at this time in New York and Canada was that he was supposed to take over the Canadian Army, meaning the American Continental and militia troops that were operating in northern New York, Lake Champlain, and in Canada. Well, those troops began retreating in the spring of 1776. And so once Gates retreated into New York around the Fort Ticonderoga and Albany area, he was no longer in Canada. And so that's where the rub came over, because Schuyler had a command in New York, and Schuyler regarded himself as the departmental commander, and Gates was, so Schuyler thought, Gates was the Army commander in Canada. So there was a lot of friction there that lasted into 1777 in the Saratoga campaign. In December, in December 1776, he was ordered south with troops to join George Washington in Pennsylvania right before the Battle of Trenton. Washington was trying to concentrate his troops. He was asking Charles Lee to bring troops down to him. Lee, very reluctant to do that. Gates brought several thousand troops, or at least started out with several thousand troops. Not all of them got to Washington's camp in Pennsylvania prior to the Battle of Trenton. And interestingly here, this is kind of where the seeds of the Gates-Washington conflict started. Gates came to the camp. Washington was going to incorporate Gates into his plan to cross the Delaware and attack Trenton. And Gates looked around and didn't really like what he saw of the American Army, their condition, how few of them there were. And he pled illness and said he would not be able to participate in any kind of active military operation in the wintertime. However, he was feeling good enough to go to Baltimore and meet with Congress and lobby them to reappoint him as the Northern Department commander. So apparently he was able to get off his deathbed and apply for a joke while Washington and the Continental Army were doing great things at Trenton. So in March of 1777, he goes back to the Northern Theater at Fort Ticonderoga. You can see I've got some markers there. You can see the red dot is where Fort Ticonderoga is. Crown Point is above there in yellow. And down below in green is where Saratoga, the Battle of Saratoga would be in 1777. So he had many conflicts with Schuyler. Kevin Weddle, if you heard him last night, had a very good summary of Schuyler's doom and gloom, very pessimistic reports in the summer of 1777 back to Congress in Washington, saying how bad the situation was, that he didn't think he could do anything, there was going to be a lot of trouble. And that's not what really Washington thought a theater army commander should be talking about. And so finally Congress gave Gates the command of the Northern Department of New York on August 4th, 1777. One of the reasons that he was appointed to this position as the British Army under John Burgoyne made their way south along Lake Champlain and then to capture Fort Ticonderoga and begin their march toward Albany, is that the New England militia favored Gates quite a bit. They liked him, they trusted him. He knew how to deal with them and their local leaders, their colonial and state leaders. And the New England militia really had a lot of animosity toward Philip Schuyler. They regarded him as haughty. He was. He was a wealthy landowner. He was not a New Englander. And so when Gates was named in part because they thought he would be able to not only command the New England militia, but also get them to mobilize more men. So, and Gates had lobbied for this command for some time, and he finally got it. Okay, this is an overview of the Saratoga campaign plan. This was the intention. You see the red arrow going from New York up toward Albany. That's what Burgoyne expected Howe to do. So William Howe was commander chief of the troops in America in New York City, and as we heard last night, most of you have probably read, Howe decided instead to have his own campaign against Philadelphia around the same time. So there's a lot about Saratoga that has come down through the years that paint Gates in a bad light, that he stayed in his tent and didn't command, that he did everything he could to limit Benedict Arnold, and that the battle was won in spite of Gates instead of because of him. And a lot of that has to do with the post-war years, well into the 19th century, to increase Washington's reputation. to praise Washington, to build him up. And Washington didn't need anything to do that. He had plenty of accomplishments in his own right. But that's where a lot of this comes from, and you can still see this in books. But the folks who give tours of Saratoga campaign, and they're always very prominent in pointing out that Gates had a much different reputation. His focus was Gates's focus was north of Albany to take up a defensive position along the west side of the Hudson River in order to block Burgoyne's column from reaching Albany and possibly joining up with Howe's column, which did not go up the Hudson River at all. And so he chose, his engineer chose a very good position on Bemis Heights, south of what's now the town of Schuylerville, back then Saratoga. And it was he exercised very good judgment in doing this, but he also focused on getting more and more militia troops, militia units from New England and New York to join his command, and to a large extent they did. The role of Benedict Arnold is also involved in this. Gates was the commander of the entire army, and Benedict Arnold had more of a combat command of the left division, left of the American lines. On the first battle of Saratoga, commonly called Freeman's Farm, on September 19th, Gates allowed Arnold, who was pressuring him all day, to attack and be more aggressive. Gates allowed a fairly powerful armed recon of the British troops. That's where the fighting was. Arnold wanted more of an aggressive attack, and I'm glossing over a lot of stuff here in the name of time. But Gates was involved in these discussions. He did have a conflict between the first battle and the second battle of Saratoga, which is commonly referred to as Bemis Heights, with Arnold. They were not on speaking terms for a number of days, but eventually patched that relationship up before that second battle. And then on October 17th, the British surrendered at Saratoga. And they surrendered by using what was called a convention. Now Gates was criticized for allowing this kind of end to the campaign. The convention was signed by the British and the Americans, and it would allow the British to bring their forces to Boston and send them home, but it did not knock them out of the war, because the British could have replaced those troops with either Hessians or troops already stationed in Ireland and England at the time. So Gates was criticized largely for that it wasn't totally a clear-cut surrender. Congress eventually negated that by pointing out to parts of the convention that the British did not comply with, and so the British troops were marched eventually. The prisoners, Hessian and British troops, and some of their officers were eventually marched all the way to Charlottesville, Virginia, from Boston, and were not sent back. Now, one of the most overt actions that Gates took during the war against Washington was his delay in getting the news of the victory to Washington. Washington was still Gates's commander. Gates didn't see it that way. Gates looked at Washington as the commander of the army in the Philadelphia area, but not overall. But if you read Washington's commission, and I'm sure all of you have, but you can see it on the Library of Congress website, that his commission was, his rank was general and commander-in-chief. That's what Congress appointed him to do. And that's what Washington expected, the niceties of etiquette is to get prompt news of the surrender from his subordinate. Now, most of you know, Washington was extremely prickly about etiquette and military protocol. And so Gates, instead of sending Washington the news, Gates sent one of his staff members, James Wilkinson, to notify Congress instead of Washington. And Washington took that as a huge snub. Now, there's Wilkinson. That's him kind of late in the war. Wilkinson was probably the biggest scoundrel of the revolution. And that's not an opinion, that's a fact. Because he wound up getting involved, some of you may know this, he wound up getting involved with the Spanish in the early 1800s and was giving them intelligence and information, and he was rumored that he was in the pay of the Spanish, and he was a traitor to the American cause. And actually Jefferson and Madison knew all about this, and he was never prosecuted for that in particular. He had to testify for other things. But in the 1830s, an American historian working in the Spanish archives in Madrid found the pay stubs where the Spanish were paying Wilkinson for years. So he was deemed a traitor, and I believe he was removed from the Society of Cincinnati as a result of that. So Gates, after Saratoga, he's the most victorious general the Americans have. Washington and his army had recently, right around the same kind of 2-month period, had lost the Battle of Brandywine in September, and had to retreat from the battlefield of Germantown, October 4th, 1777. And so right after that, the news comes, Gates has defeated Burgoyne, completely captured all their troops, their cannons, reoccupied Fort Ticonderoga. Gates is the star. And the one person who thought he was the star more than anybody else was Gates. And he was wondering, why am I reporting to this other guy? I had all this experience in the British Army. I have now won this tremendous victory. And so what Congress decided to do is appoint him to this newly established entity called the Board of War. And without going into the kind of the technical legal issues here, the Board of War had a lot of power, and it actually implied that Washington would be reporting to the Board of War, which would have made Gates, as chairman of the Board of War, his senior, what we call a senior raider today in the Army, his superior, at least administratively. And there were others that Washington and his allies, Hamilton, Lawrence, Greene, Knox, Lord Sterling, Sullivan, they were convinced that there were members of Congress and other Continental officers, such as Gates and Thomas Mifflin, who were against Washington and wanted him replaced by Gates. And this became what was known as the Conway Cabal. We won't go into details there, but Washington was convinced of this because, and I'll try to explain this as easy as I can. The guy, remember I told you there was it was an honor to bring the news back of victory. And the person who brought the Saratoga news of victory back to Congress was James Wilkinson. Wilkinson, on his way, he took his time. He even spent 2 days at his fiance's house, relaxing. And it took about 14 days to get from Saratoga to York, Pennsylvania, where Congress was meeting. But on the way, at a tavern, he meets up with another officer who was on the staff of Lord Stirling, and tells him that another officer, Thomas Conway, has written a letter to Gates criticizing Washington, and the more Wilkinson partook of alcoholic beverages, the bigger the story got. And Conway, Stirling's aide, who was listening to him, instantly reported all this back to Stirling, who gave it to Washington. And that's what caused the falling out. Eventually, Washington prevailed. It's a long story. It's a great book about the Conway Cabal. It came out 5 or 6 years ago by Mark Lender. I totally recommend that one. So Gates was kind of relegated to the New England states for a time, but he eventually went back to Travelers Rest. And sorry, I should have showed you this. This is the house that in York, Pennsylvania, that Gates occupied while he was when Congress was there. Congress met in York during the entire Valley Forge experience. That's Thomas Mifflin on the right. Okay, so Gates is eventually given command in the South. He took over the American Army after the disastrous surrender of Charleston in May of 1780. The British occupied South Carolina, were trying to consolidate their gains in South Carolina, the territory, provide support for the Loyalists there. And in the summer of 1780, he made his way to North Carolina, joined the Army, precipitously decided to attack the British base at Camden, South Carolina, made a very questionable decision on which route to take, but eventually wound up at Camden. And most of you are probably familiar with the battle. That unhappy affair, that's what Gates described in a letter to Congress. So when you open up, when your after-action report and battle report to Congress starts with that, it's all going to go downhill from there. It's not going to get any better. And here are some points I put on the map here. The yellow dot there is Hillsborough. That's kind of where the Army's headquarters was for the Continental headquarters was for a time. But he met the Army at Ramsey's Mills, where the red dot is, and then advanced across Little River to Camden, which is shown in the green dot. Most of you know, I'm not going to worry about a spoiler here, but he loses the battle. But after the battle, I'll show you a little bit more about that. But after the battle, the Army moves up to Charlottetown, which is now Charlotte, and eventually to Hillsborough. That was kind of his summer concert tour of South Carolina and North Carolina. Now, Gates is criticized, and this is an American Battlefield Trust map. I also recommend Rob Orson's book on Camden, which has excellent maps in it as well. Gates advanced on Camden in the dark on August 15th. And it just so happens, excuse me, it just so happens that Cornwallis, who had taken over the troops at Camden and decided to march from Camden to attack Gates, and they both left their camps at 10 p.m. And they had what was called a meeting engagement on the road between Camden and points north toward the Waxhaws and eventually Charlotte. And they slammed into each other at 2 in the morning. There was also some controversy. Gates was under the impression that the American Army had about 7,000 men. Continentals, Delaware Regiment, Maryland Continentals, artillery, and a lot of militia. And one of the officers in the Maryland Regiment, Otho Holland Williams, he heard this at the staff meeting and said, I don't think we have that many. And so he got a hard number, and it looks like it was more like 3,800 to 4,000. And so he came back to Gates and said, look, I think you're off. And he goes, well, how many do we have? Well, we have 4,000. He goes, that'll be enough. Okay? So he's very, very widely criticized. Some of that, though, goes back to this criticism of Gates, which was often exaggerated to make Washington's reputation even more sterling. But this was kind of a big problem for Gates. And so they meet at night, and they're on the road. So there's 2 columns hit each other in the dark. And so they both forces kind of pull back. And at night, they're trying to deploy their troops for the battle they know is coming the next morning. And they're trying to do this in the dark in a pine forest. It's very hot, very humid. They've been marching, both armies have been marching several miles by that time. And Gates, you can see the British are on the bottom of the map, the south. This takes place about 5 miles, roughly speaking, 5 miles north of the actual garrison of Camden, the actual fortified post. And you can see that Cornwallis puts his troops on both sides of the road. They're deployed. And Gates deploys his troops in what eventually was an ineffective way. That's a charitable way of saying it was a bad decision. And what he does, you can see on his, our left, Gates' right, he puts all the Continentals on that side of the road. Those were commanded by Baron de Kalb, who gets mortally wounded at the battle. And then he puts his militia on the road and over to his left. So he's got all of his experienced regulars on one side and all of his inexperienced militia, many of whom had no bayonets, had never used a bayonet. They were poorly equipped. They had been ill-fed all the way from that place on the map that I showed you where Gates met the army to the Camden area. They were subsisting on green corn and unripe peaches and apples and very, very poorly supplied. And the force here, the British attack first, and the militia are routed, except for one group of North Carolina militia who happened to be right next to the regulars. The regulars did very well in this battle. But Gates and the militia commander, who was Major General Richard Caswell of North Carolina, former governor of North Carolina, they're trying to rally the troops, and the militia are having none of it. And one thing they know for sure is that the road that goes behind them is going to Charlotte. And that's where they're headed for. But Gates and Caswell tried to rally them unsuccessfully. And Gates unfortunately decides that the best thing he can do is go back to Hillsborough and issue an order for all militia to rally at Hillsborough, regroup, and we'll try this thing again. Well, he outpaced his army because he was on horseback. And it was about 160 to 180 mile ride in 3 days. And he was widely criticized for that, especially for Alexander Hamilton. Had very sarcastic remarks about that. So he was defeated. He was eventually replaced in early December, by Nathaniel Greene. This is an interesting portrait of Gates that's rarely reproduced, but it's in the New York Public Library's collection. It's from Washington Irving's Life of Washington, and that could be one of the most realistic pictures that we have of Gates. He never gained a field command again. But he did serve, after, he was not in the Yorktown campaign, But he did serve at Newburgh on the Hudson in New York. He was somewhat involved in what was called the Newburgh conspiracy, which was a movement by the officers to pressure Congress to give them pensions and other benefits. They were going to and Washington basically quash that, with his famous talk about his spectacles. But the individual, the officer who was kind of the ringleader to try to get this movement off the ground to pressure Congress was John Armstrong, who was an aide to Gates. So he at least gets in this a little bit there. This is probably the most famous portrait of him by Gilbert Stuart. All right, he retired at Travelers Rest in late 1783. He became the first vice president of the Society of the Cincinnati, which was an organization, is still an organization, at the time was formed by officers to benefit the widows and orphans of officers killed in the war. His wife Elizabeth died in 1783. He sold Travelers Rest in 1790 and moved to Manhattan. And he died in 1806. And that is another image of Gates, which I believe was made off of that engraved one I showed you earlier. You can tell a lot about that. All right, with that, I'll stop for a couple of questions if anybody has them. Thank you. Yes, sir.
You said he was somewhat involved in the Newburgh conspiracy. You mentioned his aide. Do we have any sort of evidence regarding how involved he was in the conspiracy?
I don't think he was that heavily involved in it. He never became active. He had no intentions of going to the meeting that Armstrong called. But it's just interesting that one of his aides felt strong enough being in Gates's circle to be able to do that. So, yes, sir.
Why was that such a major problem, is trying to seek benefits for service?
That's not a military thing to do. To get a group of officers together to act politically without the commander's knowledge, that's where the real problem was, and that's why Washington wanted nothing to do with it. You know, Hamilton thought about a similar plan a year or so earlier to talk to Congress, send representatives to Congress, and kind of hint at the Army, boy, the boys are really getting restless, you know, that kind of thing. And Washington wrote him a famous letter with a famous line, "The Army is a dangerous thing to play with." And so that kind of reduced Hamilton's interest in that kind of thing. Yes, sir.
I was curious, reading the book on Adam Stevens, it was going through like their lives after the war and coming back to Lee, Gates, and area. They were talking about the Virginia Convention for the Constitution, and Stephen and William Drake were selected, but the author kind of left it. Wasn't kind of unknown as to why the thought was Gates was going to be a selection for the convention. I just didn't know it. Didn't have any insight in the book.
So that was the Virginia Convention.
Yeah.
Okay, so that was 1791, and Gates had already moved to New York by then.
Okay.
Was Gates a Federalist? Yes, he was. He was definitely a Federalist. Yep, good question. Any other questions? Yes, sir, in the back?
Yeah, what are you currently researching, or what's your next project?
I'm working on a biography of Lafayette, just his American years in his military service from when he arrives until he goes back to France. Oh, yes, sir.
I think that perhaps Braddock's defeat had an effect on Gates because he was there, and maybe that's why he's given a rap about he's behind the lines at Saratoga, and then he runs at Camden and things like that. I wonder if there's any PTSD thing as a result of Braddock's defeat. Do you ever think about that?
The comment was about how Braddock's defeat affected Gates and as a commander, could it be PTSD? I have not thought of that. That's an interesting idea. Thank you. That's very good. Yes, sir.
Wasn't he trying to create a Bunker Hill type situation in Saratoga? He wanted to issue something like that. And that's how he thought the Americans were supposed to be.
Right. The comment is that Gates at Saratoga, his plan was to take up a defensive position, hoping the British would attack, and kind of what a Bunker Hill situation. I think that is an accurate assessment of it. He did tell several, like Arnold and others who were more aggressive at Saratoga, that you know they had taken up a defensive position, which is a very, very good one at Saratoga, and really, who had the incentive to attack? Burgoyne had an objective, and he was running out of time, and Gates's objective was basically to let Burgoyne wreck his army, and that way. And really didn't have the time element himself. So I think his decision to basically have a defensive position like that while watching the left flank, I think that was a good call. Okay, well, we're going to wrap this up here. Our next speaker is going to start at 11, so please feel free to get refreshments, and we will see you back here at, let's say, 10:59.